Hi, everybody. Good to see you again today. Episode 25, Science and Faith. How do we kind of broaden our understanding of each other and how that works? But I think some of the undertones of today's episode has a lot to do with how do you partner with faith and reasoning, intellectually. How do you get from point A to point B without denying that you have a brain in your head, that you've read some, that you know things? Oftentimes, us people of faith, especially people of the book like we have a tendency to quote the Bible every time we try to talk to somebody, and it can, more often than we'd like to admit, put people off. Some of us would say in the most arrogant fashion, that's just their problem. That's not our, well, no, that's not right. That's not right a lot. Yes, we love this book that we live by and work through. At least that's what we claim. Fact of the matter is, most of us don't even read the book either. So it is essential that as we express our faith, that we know how to talk to and express ourselves in a fashion which is comfortable, engaging, sincere, that it's genuine, and respects and understands other people's mindsets, their cultural distinctions. It's important. Just because you love football doesn't mean you talk about football all day long. You have to find something else to speak about that will get you to where you want to go. And where you want to go is not to convince people or win an argument, but to openly, genuinely, authentically share what you know to be true. And in this particular case today, we're going to talk about how do you know that God is real as how we express God? How do you know that Jesus is not just some good idea from some Bible thumper somewhere carrying around the Holy Book under their arms? Why is it essential? Why are we called by the Bible to share our faith openly? It doesn't say, go quote Bible scriptures to people. Now, you all know I love the Bible. I do. I live and I breathe what it says and what it means and how it applies to our lives. However, that's not always the right thing to do. Now, normally, when I do these openings, it's really only a few seconds before we get into the lesson. But I think before I get into the slides that will help to delineate this truth and understanding today, I want to just give you an example of where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. I want you to imagine that you have just walked into a room that is only lit up by natural light from these large bay windows that are on one side of the room. Inside the room, there is a man that is standing by the windows, and there is a table off in the distance. As I walk in the room, or as you walk in the room, the man says to you, "Tell me what you see." And I said, "Well, I see you." He says, "What else do you see?" I said, "Well, I see that table over there." Well, he says, "Okay, describe the table to me." Now I'm standing by the door. I'm at least 20 feet away from the table. And I say to this man, it is a brown square table with 4 legs on it. And he starts to grin and he says, "Is that all you see?" I said, "Well, yeah, I'm looking right at it. It's a brown table, square, and it's got four legs on it." He says, "No, that's not correct." And I look at what I'm looking at, and it sure looks like a brown table with 4 legs on it. He says, "No, take a few steps closer." And I take a few steps closer, and I said, "It still kind of looks brown, and it's still square, and it's still got 4 legs." He says, "Well, here's what I want you to do. I want you to walk over to the table, and I want you to take a very close look at the top of the table. Get down almost where your face is close to the actual table itself. And I did what he said. I walked over there and I looked at the table, and all of a sudden I noticed that it wasn't just brown. There were little stripes of black. There were little edges that were a darker brown than the color that is the majority of the top of the table. And I said, well, okay, no, it's not just a brown table. It's a black and maybe two shades of brown. So it's a multicolor, he says. Yes. So it's not brown any longer? And I said, well, no. He says, well, can you touch the surface for me? And I moved my hand across the surface of the table, and it was rough. It was not a smooth top. He said, describe that for me. And I said, well, it has kind of a textured top to it. I said, he said, is it uniform or is it different? He says, well, my assumptions are it would be different. He said, so it's not a smooth table. It's multicolored. And are you sure that it's square? And I thought to myself, well, of course it's square. I'm looking right at it. There's, 4 45-degree angle things on each corner. He said, what I want you to do is I want you to get down face level, and I want you to look down the edges. And I looked down the edges, and sure enough, there were several small notches in the edge of the tables. I assume either over where. And he says, go look down another side. And I looked at, and sure enough, there was a nick and a little mark on the other side that I couldn't see from where I was. And he said, so is it square or is it multi-angled? I said, well, it's multi-angled. And he said, let's see, you also told me that there were 4 legs. And I said, yeah, I'm looking right. 1, 2, 3, 4. He says, look under the table. Sure enough, under the table has an expansion joint. And at the edge of each of those expansion joints were 2 legs that could go down on the outer part of the table to give it more stability. And he said to me, so does it still have 4 legs? He says, no, it has 6 legs. He said, so from way over there, you thought it was a brown, square, 4-legged table. Do you think that now? And I said, well, no. And he says, why? I said, well, because my perspective has changed. I've looked at it in different directions and I see different things. Well, today's lesson is going to give you an example of how to look at reasoning to God, reasoning of our faith from a different perspective. We're not going to argue science versus the Bible. We're going to talk about faith. We're going to talk about reason. All right. Are you ready? Here we go. Now, I want you to keep in the back of your mind the example that I gave you up front about the brown table and how it really wasn't brown and it really wasn't square and it really didn't have 4 legs. So you all of you, whoever's listening to this today, you're going to come into this lesson with particular perspectives that you bring into this experience. We do that in every course of every part of our life. Whatever we've experienced, whatever we think we've learned up to that point informs or prejudices our thinking as we experience something new. So I want to challenge you today to have an open mind about the possibilities that your perspectives may change. Let me tell you how science and faith have much in common. Now, first off, we're going to deal with science and faith, not science versus faith. It's not an either or here. I have had the distinct privilege in my life to have a tremendous amount of friends and colleagues who carry PhDs and sometimes 2 PhDs. And many of them are remarkable people of faith. So to say that if you believe in science, you cannot believe in a faithful expression of a God that created both the known and the unknown is simply not true. There are many people of faith in the fields of science. Not all things of science and Christian faith can be ultimately compatible. However, the foundations of science and faith are remarkably alike, and let me tell you how. Because the foundations of how you work through understanding something new, with the exception of language, is pretty well exactly the same. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. The next thing I want you to understand before we start this is we're not going to be arguing science versus the Bible. We mentioned that earlier. Because there are far too many historical errors in the process of the scientific method as it relates to dealing with what's in the Bible. And you're not going to win that argument with people. You're not. The Bible is not primarily a factual, inerrant, historically pristine book. It's not. In fact, I have said any number of times that the only people, literally the only people that believe that there are no errors or there are no conflicts in the Bible are the people who've never read the book. For those who have read it from the first page to the last page, have even done a modicum amount of study and have understood its core meanings, there is no way, there is none, other than some mythological whatever, that you would think that you're in some sort of Disney movie and every comma, every crossed T, every dotted I, every date is exactly right and there's no errors. That simply is not true, and it's never been true. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't personally adore and hold the Bible in the highest level of esteem. I do. It is the book that informs my faith and certainly my walk with Christ. You're not going to meet very many people who have a stronger foundational understanding and awareness of the Bible other than yours truly. I totally believe in the book, but I'm telling you, there are lots of people who don't, who know the book better than you do. And so it's very important that you grasp right at the beginning, as we walk into this lesson, we're not going to argue, what's in this chapter, what's in that verse versus your faith and your understanding of God. You don't win that. At least most of the time, you don't win it. And we will be demonstrating where the commonalities are to provide a reasonable bridge of understanding between these two significant paths of thinking and life experience. And these two paths are science and faith, reason and faith. So let me tell you about Albert Einstein, the 1921 Nobel Prize winner in physics and the author of the theory of relativity. He said once, he said, "The more I study science, the more I believe in God." The more I study science, the more I believe in God. Louis Pasteur, the founder of microbiology and immunology, said, "A little science distances you from God, but a lot of science brings you nearer to him." Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project, said, "The God of the Bible and the God of the genome, they're both the same. God can be found in a cathedral or in a laboratory." His point is so theologically profound here that God is everywhere at all times. Used to be, right now, and will be. God is everywhere at all times. Why do you think he only lives, or God only exists, inside a church, inside the pages of the Bible? God is not limited to bricks and a piece of paper. God can be found and experienced anywhere. You don't even have to call God God. One of my favorites, Max Planck, Nobel Prize for Physics in 1918, the founder of quantum physics, said this: "All matter," that's the physical movement, the physical stuff, whether you can see it or not, that has tangible weight to it. all matter originates and exists only by virtue of force. A physical force has to move against something, whether you can see it or you don't see it. And because it has to press against whatever it is, whether you see it or you don't see it, that's matter. And all matter originates and exists only by virtue of force. Without force, you would not know matter is. We must assume behind this force is the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix, the sum of its existence of all matter. There is a particular exercise that people who are devotees of Max Planck who say, and some of you have heard this: if a tree falls in a forest and nobody's there, does it make a sound? Well, to use this example here, that without force, matter doesn't exist, or at least you wouldn't know it exists. We can take that very, famous, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound, and we're going to make a difference. We're going to say, if the tree falls in the forest and you're not there, did it land? Did it fall over? And see, the premise of his statement here is if you aren't there to experience the force which allowed the tree to fall over, then you could come to the conclusion that it never fell. And if it never fell, it couldn't have made a sound. I know that's kind of weighty stuff, but his point here in general is, unless you are there to observe and experience how force initiates matter, then you don't know whether it happened or not. And if you don't know whether it happened or not, you cannot prove that it happened or not. And thereby, ergo, it didn't happen. So how does that relate to our faith? All right, I want you to look at this kind of this graphic of the Big Bang and how it worked. If you look over on the screen at the bell, and at the top of the bell, you'll see like a black oval, and the arrows are pointing up and outward, and right below that is dark blue, and then purple and light blue, and then it moves all the way down to the Big Bang at the bottom of that, and where it's like a star and it's yellow. All right, the process of how gravity is supposed to work is similar, that if you throw a medium-sized stone in a very calm pond, you get an explosion, you even get a splash. And then the ripples that go around and around and around the ring go outward and outward and outward. And you know what happens. It's sooner or later, those rings dissipate into nothing, and the pond becomes clear and calm again. That's the normal process of force against matter. Well, in this particular example, as we understand it today, that Big Bang has never slowed down. And in fact, it is expanding exponentially. It cannot do that based on what we know currently about how gravity works. If indeed gravity, the Big Bang, would have started something, sooner or later it would slow down and eventually stop. Well, it's working just the opposite in our understanding of what we have found out about the universe as we speak. It is continually expanding, which means the force that began it is still pushing it. It wasn't a one and out. It was a one and continuing. The force that started it is still present, still processing, still moving, and we can still see it in action. 95% of the greater universe cannot be seen directly, merely observed by the effects on objects of the mechanical expressions of physics, meaning that if indeed you see a tree move by the wind, you would say, look at the wind. You don't see the wind, you see the effects of the wind. The way that we know that um, gravity moves planets is that whatever gravity is pushing against, it is providing a pushing against a light that allows us to bend light. You can't bend light unless there's something that's pressing against it. And the light itself must be also made of matter so that there's something to push against and react from that pushing. What we do know that is 60%, 68% of our universe is made up of something called dark energy. Dark energy is the black stuff out there, and it's energy which is perpetual and expanding force. It continually moves outward. There is a strong belief that 27% of that stuff that we can't see is what's called dark matter. Matter is something physical, but you can't see it. It moves through things, but you can't see it. You can only see the effect of it. God is very much similar as we read about it in our Bibles, as we have heard people express what God is to them, how they've experienced God. It is not that God speaks in your ear metaphorically, but that you see and you experience God. It is one thing if one person sees something miraculous, you can, there's lots of ways you can explain that. But let's say over the last 5,000 years in lots of different cultures, in a lot of different languages, in a lot of different intellectual awareness, in ages that are superstitious or scientific or artistic or practical, whatever it is, whether you live on an island or a mountaintop or in a big city, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people all describing the God that has interacted and intersected in their life. They may talk about God in different languages. They may refer to God in different languages, but still they are responding to what they have experienced. If 10 people do it, okay, fine. If 1,000 people do it, and they're all in different places, and they all have similar stories, any good scientist, any good detective would start saying, there might be something there. Let's keep going. Let's talk about anecdotal stories versus anecdotal evidence. And an anecdotal story is initiated by a singular individual who relies on unverifiable information based on a personal experience of themselves or someone else. Let's give some examples of that. Somebody falls asleep on the highway. They're asleep. They're not kind of asleep. And they're heading toward the abutment of a bridge. And they wake up right before they hit. And they didn't really have a hold of the wheel. But as they went, oh no, they touched the wheel and the car moved just enough to miss the embankment. And they were saved. They didn't die. They tell that story. You could say that was a anecdotal story of something they couldn't explain. They would call it a miracle. If somebody else says, there's no way that I should be alive, I fell down that mountain. And they walked out of it with just a couple of scratches. Somebody said that I got an illness that kills 99% of the people. I met all of the criteria of those who would surely die. And I'm still standing here. There are, a gazillion different stories like that. And a lot of them are completely different from each other. How do you explain that? And just to say they're all accidental, or that there's no common causation of getting out of no way. Anecdotal evidence would say, there might be something to this. Anecdotal evidence is different from anecdotal stories because of the accumulation and the variety of how it is given, and the similarities that come from a wide variety of sources. When a medical doctor is trying to ascertain how and what a disease is, they start with anecdotal stories and then they go about trying to prove it. The scientific method all by itself is you have a hypothesis, you then have a guess of a conclusion, then you go about trying to figure out whether it's factually correct or not. If indeed you get through the process of discovering and determining through your evaluations whether it's factually correct, you either say yes it is, or you start all over and try to figure it out. People of faith are very similar. But if indeed we all have this sense of discovery and experience and determining whether or not it's a reality or not, science and faith are exactly the same in that regard. Now, let's talk about whether or not God exists and see whether or not it makes any sense whatsoever. Let's look on the consensus side. The consensus of both the faith community and the reason community. And I'm telling you that people of faith have plenty of brain power. People who are scientists have plenty of faith in their lives. But let's just, for the time being, make a simple delineation here between faith and reason. There is a singularity in a creative process of life, both known and unknown. We talked about that in the Big Bang Theory, is that this one singular force started something, and it did so with intentionality, not by accident. There is no one that can prove any different. There are observable elements in the greater universe that cannot be readily seen, but rather observed by their effects. Dark matter, dark energy, the forces of gravity are not thought of, they are experienced and observed. That's exactly the same thing that people of faith will tell you how they understand that God is, God can, God will. When people are trying to explain how the Holy Spirit works, that it's there before you, that it's there while you were there, and it prompts and continually moves you to do things you couldn't do before. How do you know? Because we've observed it. The scientific method of hypothesis, observation, and conclusions can exist in fostering more understanding. Well, the same thing applies to people of faith, whether they start from reasoning or they start from faith, or they have what almost always happens, a coalescing of those two terms. How do you know God exists? How do you know a virus exists? You start with somebody who says, I got sick. And somebody else comes in and says, I have these symptoms. And the end result is the same. And 27,000 other people come in with similar stories, and you add this collective of understanding and evidence to come to a conclusion. That's the exact same thing that happens with God and faith. Now, what are some possible conclusions? What can be tangibly observed about the foundational belief in God's existence? We can observe that people from every single culture, every single historical context, every language, every economic distinction, every intellectual process or proficiency, they all think in terms of what is beyond their self, what is there beyond their reality. How do you explain life as I have experienced it? All human beings do that. What are the connection points of varied human testimony of what is being observed? Think about that from a reason and rational point of view. If a gazillion different people all expressed that they believe that there is a deity that is the creator of all that is known and unknown, and that even though their testimonies may differ, there are several points that are exactly the same. And all good scientists would say that if 1,000,000 people have stories that are dramatically similar, and of those millions, 732,413, the core foundations of the story are exactly the same, and they all speak different languages, they all come from different time periods, there's something there. Whether or not we can prove it or not, there's obviously something going on because of the consistency and the variety of the sources of information and experiential information that we're being given. Are there enough separate sources to justify the investigative analysis? I would present to you that we have plenty of people, 1,000,000,000 people, let's say, in the last 5,000 years, collectively, have pretty well the exact same story. And what possible conclusions exist through the information supplied? Now, I want you all to think about this next phrase. It's taken from a sermon that I gave in 2009 called The Big Reveal. And it is the process of rationalizing and revealing whether Christianity itself is not only viable and vital, but valid. Evaluating Christianity, proving its worth, should never be limited to merely parsing the words on a particular page of the Bible, but rather the response of those who have been enlightened and empowered by its inspired understanding. Its inspired understanding is Christianity, the ways of Christ, the ways of Jesus's teaching and life examples. How do you know that Christianity is valid and vital and real? You don't know it by what's in the Bible. You know it by how it is affecting and affects others. If I say I'm a Christian, okay, then you could make the assumption that it has affected me. But the validity of my faith and my following the way of Christ can only be proven by how others are interacting with the force of my experience expressed outwardly, whether I say a word or not. I become that matter, that energy that presses and expresses and interacts with the world around me. It is through me, through my belief, through my heart, my feelings, my actions, that I verify Christianity or not. The same thing can be said about the Bible. Even if you think about all the things that it has some foibles in it, the core truths of the Bible are profound and right and divinely inspired. There is no other reason that it would do what it's done. In fact, I would propose that because of the inconsistencies in the Bible, that this section is conflict with this section, and that section doesn't agree with this one, and the dates over here are not the same over here. In one gospel, it says one person was at the resurrection gravesite, and another one says there are two, and another one said there was a bunch of folks. The Bible is replete with, if you read it and your heart wasn't ready to receive it, you wouldn't believe it. And yet that book has changed for the good billions of people. And there is no way it should make any sense whatsoever, and yet it makes perfect sense. How do we know that? Because of the effects that it gives. And then the giving of that information is moved through that person or a group of people, and it has literally changed the world most of the time for the better. We can say the same thing about God. It is the evidence of God in action, not only from the initiation of whatever, whoever, however God is experienced, but how it has affected us, that we either prove or disprove God's existence. I want you to think about the trials that we are in the midst of right now, of trying to find a vaccine for a virus. Companies have to first develop what they think is an accurate, healthy, and effective vaccine. But then they have to go through a testing process. They have to see whether or not what they think will work actually works. Is there going to be a large enough opportunity for gain and effectiveness for them to verify that this is actually what we think we've made, so that others can be positively affected by its curing results? That's the exact same thing as what people of faith talk about, express about the God that they know, that they know that they know. It is the same thing that anybody on the outside of the world would say, looking at someone's life and interacting with them, you can prove or disprove whether they are a valid, vital, vivacious, and Christian. Not just in the name, but who are they? How they are affecting the world around them. When we say that we believe in the Holy Spirit, not unlike dark energy, we are saying that there's something that is propelling us to do things that we could not normally do by ourselves. When I was a little kid running around the streets of St. Louis, I never thought I was going to learn multiple languages, and certainly wasn't going to be able to parse Greek. I was just happy when I got home to have some lemonade and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It was beyond my scope of understanding. And yet, things change. Your perspective changes. You learn things. Just every single one of you think about what you used to believe when you were a child. Some of those things carry you on now, but many of them you don't believe anymore because you have more experience, more depth of understanding. If you are a woman that's looking for a husband and you're 20 years old, I guarantee you've made a list. And if you're 45 years of age, I guarantee you that list is completely different. Why? Because you have different perspective. The breadth of your understanding is changed. Not unlike, for example, the table that we talked about up front. If you're wondering how to speak about whether God is real and our faith is real, you might have a particular perspective based on your experience at that moment. That's perfectly reasonable. All human beings do that. But as the example I showed you up front, I talked about up front, is when you get to a closer view, your perspective changes. You notice the subtleties. Somebody else points out other things to you, and you go, oh, I didn't see that up front. When trying to understand how to converse about God and faith, it is important to understand the other person's perspective, their context as they enter the conversation. But even if all they do is watch you, interact with you, see you interact with others, that's how we prove who we are and who we belong to, who we represent. There could be nothing more important to prove the validity and the value of our faith than how we live it, how we express it. Because it is the collective experience and expressions of what we believe and who we believe in and why we believe it and what we do to identify in that will have a value to other people. It will process, and it will help them process things that they may not have thought about before or doubted before. Be very careful how you are presenting yourself, but know this: if you claim to be a godly person, even with all your faults and failings, understand that there is something that is undergirding you, holding you up. There is something that is propelling you to do things that you could not normally do all by yourself. An outside force that continues to force and expand your horizons and your effect on other people. That's exactly the same thing. that is expressed in the Big Bang theory of the creative process. For us people of faith, that makes perfect sense because that's how we understand God created everything, both the known and the unknown, the seeable and the unseeable, because all of us, scientist or faith person, we share the validity of our beliefs through a faithful hypothesis built on an expression of experience that at the end of the day will either prove or disprove what the hypothesis or the original assumptions were. I hope and I pray this makes you think about not only how to speak and understand, but the value of proving and demonstrating who and what we are. I wish you well, and I hope and I pray that when we see you for the next episode, you're going to enjoy that just as well. Thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate you having the faith and the commitment to continue to learn and to continue to express and to continue to share what you've learned through all of these episodes. God bless you. God keep you. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.